Well, like all those who have preceded me at this podium, I want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of the Camden Conference for inviting me. A very special thank you to obviously someone who is missing from our audience tonight, Charlotte Singleton, who I must confess did write the single most persuasive invitation by email that got me to come here. Bruce Cole, of course, followed up by asking me to speak about India's regional role. And I must confess, I responded positively with alacrity because I thought, oh, this is a simple subject. It's very easy to talk about India's regional role. Until I actually started applying my mind to the problem, and I realized that it was much more complex than I originally thought. First, because India is not limited by a single region, but multiple regions. And that's what explains the title of this presentation, which is India in its many regions. My presentation today will also focus on what I hope will be the less controversial aspects about India. Because Indian foreign policy and the deep structure of its relationships with its many neighbors, near and far, have been fairly consistent over the years and decades. And they do not evoke the sharp partisan sentiments and responses either within the country or outside. And so in that sense, I have a much easier job than many of those who preceded me today. I'm going to tell you a story that is painted in fairly bold strokes, and I'll keep the subtleties for the question and answer. Let me start by trying to understand India's grand strategy, because I believe there have been two constants in India's approach to the world since its independence. India has pursued four objectives quite consistently since 1947. The means by which those objectives were pursued varied. There was a strategy which is described during the Cold War, and there was a strategy that changed in parts in the aftermath of the Cold War. But the key objectives of preserving internal unity and territorial integrity, accelerating economic growth, advancing and acquiring military capabilities, advancing technology, and then, of course, securing global recognition have really been part and parcel of India's objectives. Those have simply not changed. What is equally striking is that from the beginning, India did not see itself as limited to simply the region in which it was physically located. And even before India became independent, Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first prime minister, in 1927 made the argument that India's nationalism is, and of course will be, based on the most intense internationalism. In other words, what he was trying to say was that India's playground would be the world because its interests are deeply intertwined with global concerns. And that India needs the world just as emphatically as the world needs India. And this view was affirmed just before India became independent in 1946, when he essentially made the argument that India's destiny was to take its place among the great powers of the international system, or else it would have no destiny at all. And so India's grand strategy has been deeply linked, not just with those four objectives that I laid out, but those four objectives as they intersect in an ambition for greatness. But it's easy to talk about India and the world. What does that mean concretely? And so I want to try and decompose the world into trying to understand the specific geographies that India operates in, how it operates in, and to what ends. And there's no better place to start than the British Raj, because the British Raj left a lasting legacy on India's strategic consciousness. And the British Raj essentially defined Indian interests across two circles. There was one circle which was called the inner ring, and this is the circle that essentially encompasses the Indian subcontinent, where British power was absolute, where British power was paramount. And there was an outer circle, which was called the outer ring, where the British exercised preponderant influence because they reached the conclusion fairly early on that Indian security and India's ambitions would not survive if it was not insulated from the larger geopolitical competition in the world at the time. And that's when Britain got involved in what has now come to be known as the Great Game, an effort to isolate the jewel in the crown from all the foreign pressures that might impact upon it. When India became independent, it simply updated this model to account for new realities. And so the inner ring remained exactly where it was, which is the subcontinent proper. India's outer ring essentially encompassed large areas of what today we call the Middle East, and what in India is often called West Asia, and the eastern extremities of India's extended neighborhood, Southeast Asia. And of course, because India was now an independent power, as opposed to a colony of an imperial state, India began to think of its relationships with the wider world as well. And so you got a global ring where India began to engage with great powers as an equal in a way that it aspired throughout its freedom struggle. I'm going to talk about each of these rings in some detail to give you a sense of how Indian foreign policy has proceeded with respect to achieving that ambition of greatness that Jawaharlal Nehru had defined for the country long before it became independent. And let us start with the inner ring. If there is one characteristic of the inner ring, it is today India's dominance within that ring, but without hegemony. Not that India would not like hegemony. All nations do if they can get it on the cheap. But India has found it rather difficult to translate natural dominance into political hegemony. And to understand why, this slide tells an interesting story. There is perhaps no sub-region in the international system which is marked by such striking asymmetries of power. India simply towers above all its neighbors. Now, this is obviously a measure of GDP, and I'm using GDP as a proxy for national power, just to make the point that this is a region that essentially is dominated by India. And yet, dominance does not translate into an ability to get one's way. And why is that? It's because the natural unity of the subcontinent, which the British enjoyed during the Raj, is now characterized by multiple fractures. New states, which have come into being as a result of the processes of independence and partition. New states, which are characterized by their own nationalisms, and nationalisms which very often compete with India's nationalism. And so the kind of absolute control that the British Raj enjoyed within this entire geographic space has now been replaced by contested control. India has dominance. India would like the smaller countries in the region to accede to its preferences, but those preferences have to be negotiated, and sometimes they have even got to be fought over. In fact, it is ironic that despite this dramatic domination, India has had problems with about every one of its neighbors since 1947, with the exception perhaps of Bhutan. And I'll come back in a few minutes to talk about the structural factors that have made this contestation inevitable. But before I get there, I want to flag one particular contestation which dominated international consciousness until very recently, and which really puts into stark relief the struggle that India has had to translate its dominance into hegemony. And that is the relationship with Pakistan. Until very recently, when you spoke about India in the international space, you almost talked about Pakistan in literally the same sentence. And among us fellow travelers who study South Asia, India-Pakistan was almost a natural hyphenation. Now we know the reasons for why this contestation arose. There were ideational differences about what the post-colonial order was to be. Pratap Mehta talked about the nationalism of Jinnah, which identified the need for a homeland for Indian Muslims. And unfortunately, Mr. Modi appears to be validating Jinnah's deepest fears in the way that Indian nationalism is now evolving. There were territorial disputes over Kashmir, and there were power political disputes simply that arose from the asymmetries of power. And this slide captures the tortured history of India and Pakistan over the last several decades. But guess what? This is a story that is now a story of the past. And you see this by looking at this slide, which captures the relative growth of India and Pakistan since 1980. In 1980, India and Pakistan were roughly economic peers. And that symmetry lasted pretty much until about 1990. But from 1990, the delta widens in ways that simply push Pakistan off the pedestal as a genuine geopolitical competitor. And so Pakistan is no longer the challenger to India that it once was, no longer the challenger that consumes Indian attentions. But still, Indian hegemony has proved to be a bridge too far. And the reason for that is what I alluded to earlier, the structural problems that define India, starting with geography. Let me go back to just point out something that is worth paying attention to. If you look at this map of South Asia, you realize one striking fact. India shares borders with every one of its neighbors, but very few neighbors share borders with one another. In other words, India becomes the magnet for all their natural resentments. And those resentments cannot be diffused by competitions with other states. In the two instances where neighbors actually happen to share borders, the normal mechanics of international politics kick in. So Afghanistan and Pakistan share borders, and I promise you that is not exactly a fraternal relationship. Bangladesh and Burma shared borders, and we talked just a few minutes ago about the challenges of the Rohingya and the stress that is put on the Burmese-Bangladeshi relationship. So geography matters. And because India has been blessed or cursed by the geography of not sharing borders, but other states not sharing borders among themselves, geography has put India in a position where it has simply been unable to be as persuasive as it would like. Of course, then there are the forces of nationalism. India is not immune to this. Every country in South Asia has its own brand of nationalism, and those nationalisms inevitably end up being directed against India. Every one of these states also has domestic cleavages. And the domestic cleavages often take the form of political parties, some of which support India, some of which enjoy Indian support, and other political parties that are opposed to India and don't enjoy Indian political support. And so the relations between India and its partners often vacillate depending on which political party happens to come into power at any given point in those countries. Let's not forget, the entire subcontinent is also located in the world itself. And there are external pressures. The Cold War brought the great powers of the day to the Indian subcontinent. The United States ended up in a partnership with Pakistan, and that emboldened Pakistan and empowered the Pakistani challenge to India. Today, the role once played by the United States has now been taken over by China, with China empowering Pakistan in its challenge towards India. Economics. Unlike China, which actually created a huge sphere of influence because of an outward-looking economic policy, India's economic strategy since independence has been inward-looking. It has focused on the expansion of its domestic market rather than becoming a trade and export machine. Now, there were very good reasons for why India went this way, but the consequence of that choice is that India found it difficult to integrate the subcontinent and legitimize its dominance in a way that China did in its own environment. And finally, India's strategic culture, which, after all is said and done, is still a relatively diffident strategic culture. Although India has muscled its neighbors on many an occasion, what is striking about India is that it has not used its natural dominance to employ force, even when force was arguably justified in the context of its competition. So that tells us a story of why Indian hegemony is still elusive in a region where it looms larger than life. Let me quickly go to the outer ring. This was a ring where British India had extraordinary influence. As late as 1960, a good decade and a half after India's independence, the Indian rupee was still the currency. The Indian rupee was still the currency in the crucial states of the Gulf, going back to the legacies of the Raj. Today, India has interests in its west and in its east, but its influence is actually much modest than the influence that the Raj exercised in the heyday of empire. What are India's interests in this part of the world? The first thing that's striking about India's interests to its west is that it has managed to bridge really difficult chasms. So India today enjoys a quite cordial relationship with Iran, even as it has a very cordial relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And even as it has a very close and good relationship with Israel. So in some sense, India's bridging magic has managed to overcome binaries that have stymied many other states in their relations with this part of the world. There is a similar story to be told in East Asia. Today, India has gone out of its way to build up its relationship with Singapore, to maintain a very strong relationship with Vietnam, and to double down on an old relationship with Indonesia, which it had a partnership with at the height of the non-aligned movement. And it has maintained these relationships because looming over India is, of course, the specter of China. And I'm going to say a few words about that in a few minutes. So when India looks at its outer ring, its extended neighborhood, it looks at this ring simply as an opportunity to entice these partners to become part of India's ambitions for greatness, to use the wealth of the greater Middle East to stimulate investments in India, to make the energy links between the Gulf and India stable and reliable, and in the case of a country like Israel, to build a partnership that gives India access to very sophisticated arms that it either cannot get from the United States or traditional suppliers like Russia. And of course, in Southeast Asia, the focus is simply on limiting Chinese penetration in the region in order to give the Southeast Asian states a measure of support from the outside. Which gets me to the last ring, which is the global ring. And the best way to think about this ring is India's desire for a multiplicity of partnerships, but without alliances. In fact, another way of describing this is strategic promiscuity. During the Cold War, India had a very diffident relationship with the international system. It was in a defensive crouch. And non-alignment was meant to prevent other states from adversely impacting India's choices. After the Cold War, India has been marked by striking increases in confidence, strong economic growth, and has benefited from having strong personalities like Prime Minister Modi. And that has resulted in a very interesting shift in India's approach to the outer ring. India has now wholeheartedly embraced multiple partnerships with major powers that may not have very much agreement among themselves. And just as India has managed to work the bridging magic in West Asia, it appears, at least so far, to have worked a similar magic in terms of its relationship with the great powers. All this, however, all this success is challenged by a new reality, which is going to be India's predicament for many decades to come. For the first time in over 3,000 years of India's history, it faces a superpower on its doorsteps, and that superpower is China. Think about this for a moment. In 1980, the Chinese economy and the Indian economy was roughly the same size. Today, the Chinese economy is between 5 and 6 times India's size. This chart is almost a mirror image of the chart between India and Pakistan. Whereas India has pulled away from Pakistan in very dramatic ways, China has pulled away from India in very dramatic ways. And this growth has geopolitical consequences. And I've put, just for purposes of comparison, the relative size of the 3 economies that matter in this game. And what this tells you is Indian security is going to be a very long and complicated endeavor because of the difference in these 2 capabilities. Now, the United States and China have a better shot of becoming peers than India has vis-à-vis China, at least in the near term. But it's not simply about power differences. China has multiple issues with respect to India. There are territorial disputes, and Ambassador Rao referred to those last evening. There are penetrations in India's maritime space, in the Indian Ocean. In India's space, outer space, India's outer space systems in the last 5 to 6 years have been under consistent intrusion from the Chinese military. There are cyber penetrations of India's government and non-governmental networks. There's, of course, Pakistan, which has replaced the United States with China as its new superpower protector. And China today is a major economic presence in all of South Asia. China and India are status rivals in Asia, have been for a long time. The Chinese have become the single biggest impediment to India's recognition in the global system. And of course, Chinese communism and Indian democracy do not sit very easily. But more than anything else, it is the military asymmetries that ought to capture attention. The defense budgets are asymmetrical. The army personnel, that's the only area where India has some advantage, but even here I would be careful because there are many qualifications to these numbers. Naval vessels, Air Force aircraft, nuclear weapons, space satellites, you name it. Essentially what we are talking about is a very powerful state that is sitting on India's borders. Now, India has attempted to deal with this essentially by constructing a tightrope walk. And that tightrope walk consists of internal balancing, which is mobilizing its own resources, and external balancing, which is creating new relationships with outside powers. The internal balancing has focused in recent times on trying to emulate China's success with respect to manufacturing, positioning India as a new manufacturing center in order to stimulate India's economic growth in this coming competition with China. Whether it'll be successful is anyone's guess. My colleague Arvind Subramaniam will talk about this tomorrow morning, and you can reach your own judgments. But it's the external balancing that is really most striking. The most important relationship in external balancing today is India's relationship with the United States. And India has benefited from the fact that its own relationship with China has become competitive just at about the same time that the US-China relationship has become competitive. So on the old Kautilyan principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the fact that China and the United States have a rivalry, and the fact that India and China have a rivalry, it's almost mathematical, pushes India and the United States ever closer together. But beyond this, India has also attempted to diversify its relations. And the biggest investment it has recently made is in intra-Asian balancing, a new partnership with Japan, the United States, and Australia, what is often called the quadrilateral. Now, if this was all there was to it, it would be a very simple story. We've seen these balance of power politics play a part in different parts of the world. What is fascinating about India is this, that even as India has managed to build a very strong relationship with the United States, it has adamantly preserved an old relationship with Russia. So strategic promiscuity is not just an idea, it's an actual reality. And India continues to maintain a diverse set of relationships with Australia and so on, and so, with Europe and so on and so forth. So you're really looking at a multi-dimensional set of partnerships which are going to remain the modus operandi of Indian foreign policy for a long time to come. And it obviously has very important implications for the United States, which Dan Markey is going to speak to you about tomorrow. But I want to leave you with one thought as I leave the stage. When you think of Indian foreign policy over the long arc from 1947 to the present day and beyond, remember there has been one motivating ambition. How does India use the world in order to leaven its own rise to power? And what we have seen in the last 60 years is an object lesson in astute strategic calculation. A strategic calculation that is simply not going to go away, but is in time only going to play itself out on a bigger and bigger stage. Thank you.